Hispanic story of the United States constitutes the warp, a north-south axis along which the United States was made. So you have written a book that, as you put it, adopts only one of the possible perspectives, and it is the Hispanic one. You have written an essay designed to open a different vista. You explain in it, and it's probably the main point, that biculturalism and even bilingualism will work in the United States, contrary to, as you say, other forms of multiculturalism, which are not perhaps working so well elsewhere. So, may I ask you, how far do you think that this process has gone in the United States so far?
Well, thank you, Santiago. It's always difficult to answer a question which begins with the words "how far," because it implies that you can answer by suggesting that a certain proportion of a journey has been completed. But of course, one doesn't know how long the entire journey is. The answer I would like to give is rather oblique. It's an answer to a slightly different question, which is that the United States is and always has been a land of many cultures, and that the Hispanic contribution, by which I mean the contribution of people whom the United States Census now classifies as Hispanic, has always been there. And it's always been fundamental, and you can't understand the United States without taking it into account, because the Spanish language has been spoken in the territory of what is now the United States for much longer than English, and because Spanish settlers who came to the territory of what is now the United States in the 16th century, the century preceding that in which English colonists began to establish enduring settlements, brought with them forms of culture, including language, including the Catholic faith, including forms of economic activity like ranching and farming. California has proven to be tremendously good agricultural country, but there was no agriculture there before Spaniards introduced it. And of course, art and architecture. So all of those contributions from people who came to the United States, what is now the United States, from the Hispanic world, are so enduring and have been there for so long that it's just impossible to imagine what the United States would be like without them. It would be a different place. It wouldn't be the United States we know. So in a way, the answer to your question, how far has it come, is, well, it hasn't come or gone. Anyway, it's always been there, and it's always been of tremendous importance.
You say, along the same lines, that people who know their past are better equipped to face their future.
Well, I hope that's right. If not, I'm out of a job as an historian, I suspect.
No, but it is, I entirely agree with you, but I was going to add, do you think that many so-called Hispanics or Hispanos in the United States know about the Spanish part of their past?
No. The reason I felt it was worth writing a book was in the hope that it might introduce some readers, probably very few, because I never expect people to read my books in any large numbers. I'm always surprised when anybody reads them at all. But because people don't know this past, I thought it was worth pointing it it out. I'm not, of course, the first person to have done so. There's been a very important tradition in US historiography, which people in America in historical circles refer to typically as the borderlands tradition, a long tradition which goes back to in some ways, to the late 19th century, of writing regional histories of parts of the United States that have a very strong Hispanic presence and have had a very strong Hispanic presence historically. But that trend, that tradition in historical writing in the United States has never kind of entered the mainstream. It's never been in the textbooks. It's never been in high school curricula nationally. It hasn't changed the way people perceive their country as essentially a product of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant dominion. And of course, most Hispanics accept the myth that has prevailed amongst their neighbors and very often feel unwelcome and out of place in a country where they should feel at home because it belonged, much of it belonged to their ancestors and the ancestors of people whom they can identify with in terms of culture, in terms of religion, in terms of language, in terms of identity.
Going back to the beginning of the story, which you tell, which is, of course, 500 years ago, you often compare the English and later British Empire with the Spanish Empire. Why do you think that the Spanish Empire lasted for so long?
Well, before I answer that, I should say that I think the justification for comparing the Spanish and the British empires is obviously twofold. Any comparison doubles your chances of understanding something. That's why our Lord spoke in parables. It's really important to embrace comparison as a technique of inquiry. And in the case of the British and Spanish empires, the further particular justification is that the British Empire, the English Empire as it was before it became British, was directly inspired by and modelled on the Spanish Empire. When you read the English projectors of empire in the reign of Elizabeth I, they're always referring to Spain as the model which they envy and which they wish to rival and the place of which they want to usurp. And I think you can actually, trace behaviors amongst English conquistadores, if one can call them that, which are quite conscious imitations of behaviors that they've read about in histories of Spanish empire building. So that's a basis for making the comparison. Your question implies that you think the British Empire was very short-lived.
No, the English Empire was, of course, I'm playing a game which is impossible to sustain, because it's true that the British in North America and in the Caribbean indeed lasted for a long time, in fact longer than the Spaniards in certain areas, but the same question could be asked about the British Empire. It is surprising to us in our 21st century the fact that some empires lasted for a very long time.
Yes, well, of course, I do see the force and importance of your question, and I can think of at least 4 ways of approaching an answer to it, and there's a certain, mutual tension, maybe even contradiction between. Although it's the first way to answer your question, we focus on the Spanish case, is to say that it's the wrong question. Because what's surprising about the Spanish Empire isn't so much that it endured as that it happened in the first place. This is, I always say that I'm the biggest Spanish patriot in the world because I don't have to live here. I don't have to suffer, travails and hardships of life. So it's easy, for me to have a romantic and idealistic notion of Spain. But the truth is, this is a country with very modest natural resources, which has always been underpopulated, really, relative to other comparable countries. Much of the surface of which is mountain and desert and is actually sort of inexploitable, and which, until the forging of this great worldwide empire, had been riven by internal conflicts and pretty much had been, relegated to the margins of European politics. So it's amazing, that this empire should have happened at all. I always say the Spanish Empire is like what Dr. Johnson said about a dog walking on its hind legs. It's something you mustn't expect it to be well done. You should admire it for happening at all. And I suppose that the second thing to say about your question is that it's if one admits that it's a valid question, it's still a sort of question mal posée, because in order to understand something historically, you've got to dispense with hindsight. You've got to imagine, got to try and imagine what it was like, what it felt like to be there at the time. That's, the historian's objective, to try and relocate himself or herself in the past. And of course, when the Spanish Empire was being made, when its history was unfolding, people didn't know when it was going to end. And they didn't think that it was going to endure. In the early 17th century particularly, people who lived in the Spanish monarchy, overwhelmingly, to judge from the surviving sources, were convinced that they were in decadence and that everything was falling apart, and they reproached themselves for this, and they couldn't understand how it was that the Roman Empire had lasted so long, and their empire, which had only just really sprung into being in historical terms, appeared to be in imminent peril. And of course, they were wrong. I mean, it didn't collapse. Some parts of it fell away in the 17th century, but on the whole, the overall dimensions of the empire continued to grow until right, into the 1790s. That's the maximum moment. People don't realize this typically, but the maximum moment the Spanish monarchy was in the 1790s, when the King of Spain's Welsh agent raised the flag of Spain on the banks of the upper Missouri amongst the Mandan Indians. So in spite of people's perception, it did last for longer than they expected. But it lasted for a relatively long time in some places and a relatively short time in others. It lasts a very long time in Cuba. It lasts a very short time in California. So it kind of doesn't make sense to say, why did it last so long? You really have to look at the different parts of it and say, what was special about those? Why did it endure in some places and not in others? And I do think that one of the great trends in historical scholarship in my time has been the discovery, and perhaps not well represented amongst an older generation of historians, is very well represented amongst a generation of my students. You just don't go on looking at these great cosmic questions. Look at particular places, find the right points of comparison, and then, when you've investigated a subject like the Spanish Empire regionally and locally, then you can stand back and try and form a kind of global and cosmic vision. But where it did last, in the parts of the Spanish Empire, your question is both valid and makes sense. And the places where Spanish Empire did last, it lasted for the same reason, in my opinion, as all enduring empires last. There's one reason which is common to all of these cases in my submission, and that is that you can only make an empire last if you have indigenous communities, subject and victim peoples on your side. No empire, even really sort of technically powerful empires in the 20th century, have survived when they've alienated their own subjects. Now, the great genius of the Spanish monarchy, in my opinion, was to be very uninterventionist and to leave indigenous incumbent elites in control of their own sources of power and wealth and rely on their cooperation to keep the empire going. If you look, say there's a famous document, it's become famous in recent years, a Maya map of the world of the late 16th century, and the center of the world is the town of Mani, and then around it there are these other Maya statelets and traditional polities and dynastic territories, and Spain is on the edge of this Maya world. So they discovered Spain. It was an important presence for them, but what mattered to them was what was happening in their little patch of the monarchy. And as long as the Chu of Mani were in control of their own little world, they were very happy to collaborate with the Spanish monarch. And you see this over and over again in case after case. And the Spaniards were very useful to indigenous communities, especially in the New World and the Philippines, where they could perform the role of arbitrators in local disputes. It's so useful, having an arbitrator who comes into your world from outside, because that outside is objective. He or she isn't already involved in all the conflicts and structures of the society which might warp his or her objectivity. The outside is also a great marriage partner. I think one of the ways in which the Spanish Empire worked was through the intermarriage of Spaniards with indigenous elites, and the outsider's great person to marry, again, because you marry the outsider, you don't exacerbate any of the internal conflicts in your own society. That's why, even until quite recently, European monarchs always chose their brides from out. Now they choose them from outside the social circle, like Princess the Queen, as she is now, Letizia, or Princess Kate in England. But typically, they always looked outside the country until very recently for their marriage partners. The outsider is also, very easily sanctified. It's amazing, isn't it, when you look at the history of the Spanish Empire, how much of it was run by priests, Jesuit reductions. There were no lay Spaniards, there were no soldiers. There were lots of Franciscan missions where the nearest Spanish soldier was hundreds of miles away, but the indigenous people still kind of did what the priests told them. And I think that, the outsider is sanctified very often by distance. I'm probably taking too long answering your question now, but you've inspired me with an enthusiasm which I'm incapable of controlling. You know how in our own society we value commercial products according to the distance they travel. We pay, ridiculous prices for imported stuff, which is no better than, what is produced locally, but it requires a sort of exotic aura and added value. But people are often like that. Many cultures around the world, people are valued because they've come from outside because they've traveled a great distance, because they've been sanctified by association with the divine horizon. So I think, as arbitrators, as marriage partners, as holy men and women, Spaniards were extremely useful to the indigenous societies which they joined and which joined the Spanish monarchy in turn. And it's in those relationships that you can find the real causes of an enduring, sustainable presence. When it makes sense to the indigenous people, that's when an empire lasts. Of course, if you provoke indigenous resistance, then the empire collapses. I'm not so sure, however, about the diffusion of the Spanish language. It was adopted as an elite lingua franca in the world of the Spanish monarchy, and of course its power as a lingua franca extended beyond the frontiers of the monarchy. I mean, in North America, all the indigenous peoples who lived in the penumbra of the Spanish monarchy adopted Spanish for purposes of trading with the people who were on the other side of the frontier. But it never displaced indigenous languages as a language of daily use. And again, I think that's a sign of a sign of flexible strength. In order to keep a polity going, you have to know, where to draw the limits of the changes that you want to make in indigenous culture. The Spanish monarchy had one big change that it was determined to impose wherever it went, and that, of course, was to change people's hearts and minds, to change their religion. It was tremendously successful in diffusing Catholicism. They didn't care much about the language. Indeed, to some extent, it was understood amongst most clergy by the 16th century. I mean, this is an idea which goes back to the 14th century, to Ramon Llull, but really by the 16th century it became very widely assumed amongst the clergy, especially the missionary clergy, that if you really want to convert people, you learn their language.
Of course.
Because you need to know the culture from which you're converting them, and you indoctrinate them in their own language. And so strangely, the main cultural objective of the Spanish monarchy tended to keep the indigenous languages intact.
Of course, as you know, it was actually after the independence of the Spanish territories in the New World, after their independence, that the great effort was made to teach the Spanish language throughout the new countries.
Yes.
Of course, the Spanish authorities were not particularly interested in that.
Of course.
Apropos of the Protestant work ethic, you write this: the Protestant work ethic demands a solemn and sustained digression because, in spite of the fact that there never was any such thing, people believe in it with desperate, defiant tenacity. I am constantly surprised at the persistence of the notion amongst sociologists. An influential Harvard history professor, you don't mention his name, which is a pity, but I hope you will tell me off the record afterwards, has recently endorsed it at length in a popular television series.
Yes, there's no secret about it. I don't mind saying it's Neil Ferguson, whom I like and admire tremendously. He's
Neil
wrong
Ferguson,
about this, yes.
I do admire him, but I don't agree with everything he says. Even
No, it
some
would be
of
so
my
boring. Wouldn't it be boring, if we all agreed with it? Indeed, when people agree with me, I start changing my mind, because I think there's nothing less stimulating than agreement. If people agree with you, I think it's a sort of sure sign that you're not saying anything terribly interesting.
Well, now I will only show my agreement on this point, which I think is so brilliant that you won't even feel tempted to change your point of view. Even some of my Catholic students of Notre Dame were taught to believe in it in high school. They were perverted, obviously, by Protestants. I must begin, in fairness to readers, with two admissions. First, I am a Catholic. It is important to point this out because a lot of people love to hate Catholics, and I regard it as an obligation of Christian charity to give people a chance to hate me, if that is what turns them on. My second confession is that I am lazy. So I am both lazy and Catholic, but there is no necessary connection between the two, just as there is no necessary connection between Protestantism and hard work. Well, I really think it's as good as anything that Gibbon dared to write. And it's not even in the decent obscurity of a learned language.
I see.
But
Well, I now understand.
In the world language of English.
I now understand. When you said that you had something on which you agreed with me, you meant that it was that I'm lazy.
No, I disagree profoundly with you on that point.
Yes. It is important, isn't it, to shatter this myth of the Protestant work ethic. I mean, it's true, that Luther and Calvin go on a lot about work, but so did every 16th century moralist. Santo Tomas de Villanueva was obsessed by a sort of work ethic.
Yes. And all the Benedictines were...
I'm sorry?
All the Benedictine monks.
Laborare est orare.
Exactly, yes.
St. Ignatius of Loyola's prayer says, teach me, good Lord, to toil and not to seek for rest, to labor and not to ask for any reward. So work was a really big sort of moral obsession with 16th century thinkers. And it is also true that in Protestant countries there was more sort of persecution of the idle than there was in Catholic countries. I mean, typically in Protestant countries they created these institutions which obliged people to work even if there was no demand for the products that they were making. So I can understand, why people believe in the Protestant work ethic, and I can also understand why Weber appealed to it as a source of historical explanation of the vast changes which he was familiar with in his time, because it did look as though, broadly speaking, industrialization was happened earlier and with greater intensity in Protestant countries than in others. It's also true that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Protestant countries had much better records of victory in war, often against Catholic ones, than vice versa. But the facts are sufficient to explain why people believe in it, but they're not sufficient to justify it. Because in the early modern period, most of the great capitalists, most of the real heroes of the work ethic weren't Protestants. Indeed, if you look at it globally, there weren't even Christians. There was a lot of Jews and Jains and Muslims and even Buddhists and Hindus in the early modern period who didn't share the later fastidiousness about the corrupting and polluting effects of work on sanctity that we now associate with those religions. And in Weber's own day, he should have noticed that although the first industrial nation, Britain, was predominantly Protestant, the second industrial nation was Belgium, which was 100% Catholic. You find, just the same gospel of work amongst 19th century industrialists and Catholic as in Protestant environments. So the facts didn't really support the theory, and I think the reason why Weber committed so much intellectual and emotional investment to this theory was that he was really looking for an alternative to Marxism. He wanted a sort of a bourgeois and religious explanation of what happens in history rather than a proletarian and atheist explanation. And his promotion of the theory of the Protestant work ethic was part of that. And of course he did it so well that he convinced everybody that it was true. But it's just been one of those myths that one labours in vain, to excise from people's consciousness. And I think that there are certain things that people just have accepted, and they've become so entrenched in educational tradition. It's probably impossible now to get people to see the truth.
Well, talking of historians, I think you perhaps would enjoy having a look at this exhibition, which is being shown right here in the National Library in Madrid, which is called in English Designing America. And it's a very interesting set of plans and maps. Indeed, it's in some aspects quite close to your book, Our America. So
yes, no, I feel very chastened to see how people here have been thinking along similar lines, and I've been reading the catalogue with great fervour. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to seeing the exhibition.
Maybe you have detected